Claude Monet. Prolific. Monet's painting career spanned nearly 70 years. WIldenstein's Catalogue Raisonee shows 1,963 entries, of which this one, W1963, Rosebush, is Monet's last work. Gifted. The post-impressionist Paul Cézanne said of Monet that he was merely an eye, but God, what an eye, in the aim to represent the world as perceived, but with his intensity of discrimination of the colours of nature. Radical. The Impressionists, in particular Monet, changed the course of art history, bypassing the salon system, largely rejecting studio work on mythology or history in favour of the artist's vision. But there's another side to Monet. Depressive. In 1868, Monet attempted suicide in the Seine. Later in life, incapacitated by his moods, there were days on which the artist would isolate himself from the world, unable to leave his bed. Secretive. Monet claimed to have painted a work, The Woman in a Green Dress, in 4 days, when in fact he spent months working on it. He refused to talk to journalists about whether he painted exclusively en plein air, or whether in fact he worked on canvases in his studio. Troubled. Racked by self-doubt as to his abilities as an artist, despite his success and fame. Ordering his gardeners to burn large numbers of his canvases that Monet felt might damage his reputation. This video aims, with the use of letters and essays from Monet and his contemporaries, to look at both sides of Monet and the development of his work in its art historical context. Monet constantly moved around looking for inspiration, from Paris to Normandy to London, Holland and Norway, the south of France and Italy. Monet was born in Paris in 1840, but moved with his family to Le Havre at the age of 5. Monet did not take well to school, and after the death of his mother was sent to live with his aunt, who encouraged him with his art. In 1861, having drawn a low number in France's National Service Lottery, Monet was forced to serve in Algeria for 7 years, as his father refused to intervene. After Monet fell ill, a year or so later, however, his aunt agreed to pay for a substitute to exempt him from service, on condition he study art formally. And Monet went to Paris again in 1862, where, having hated traditional art school, he joined Charles Gleyre's studio, and met and befriended Pierre-Auguste Renoir and Frédéric Bazille, and together they would form the core of the Impressionist group, painting together and discussing in the Café Gerbois, and holding the first of 8 Impressionist exhibitions in 1874. To understand Monet's talent, we also need to see it in its multiple contexts, one of which is the art historical traditions that it came from. The first half of the 19th century had seen 2 competing schools of art, classicism and romanticism, the former usually more conservative and focusing on myth, the latter concerned with political and personal freedom and emotion. Realism developed as a rejection of the idealism of both, insisting on a true representation of the present and visible world. Although Charles Baudelaire has strong romantic elements in his work, prioritizing imagination and the eternal transcendent beauty in nature, he also synthesized this with realist aims, insisting that the painter should paint the present, what he saw with his own eyes. In The Painter of Modern Life, Baudelaire says of art that beauty is made up of an eternal invariable element, and of a relative circumstantial element, the age, its fashions, its morals, its emotions. The pleasure from the representation of the present is due to its essential quality of being present. The painter makes it his business to extract from fashion whatever element it may contain of poetry within history, to distill the eternal from the transitory. The Barbizon artists of the 19th century, as part of the rejection of classicism and romanticism for a more naturalistic depiction of the world, had prioritized painting en plein air, painting outside, and directly transcribing what they saw in nature onto the canvas. The name of the group came from the Barbizon village in the Fontainebleau hunting forest outside Paris, where many of the group painted, Daubigny, Millet, and Corot included. But Corot, as would Monet, travelled to Italy in search of inspiration. Monet's teacher and mentor, the painter Eugène Bodin, had been encouraged to paint outside en plein air from meeting the Dutch artist Johan Jonkind. This work by Jonkind is from 1864, and it shows his work's parallels with Monet's, working quickly outside, using rapid brush marks of different colours to capture the various tones of the object, mixing the colours on the canvas. Monet met Eugène Bodin in Le Havre in 1857, and Bodin taught Monet the techniques of painting en plein air. As Monet recalled late in life, "I was 15 or so at the time. One day Bodin said to me, 'Do what I do, appreciate the sea, the light, the blue sky.'" He had received some training from Jonkind, whose work lies with Corot's at the origin of what has been called Impressionism. This work by Bodin from 1864 shows many of Monet's later preoccupations with the effects of sunlight on the air, using rapid brushwork, and using figures to emphasize the present, rather than to express any great human or historical drama. The Creator has spread this warming, radiant light, and it is less this world we reproduce than the element in which it is enveloped. This quotation from Bodin shows a preoccupation in common with Monet's, that of painting light, its effects, its changes, its colours. This work from 1858 is marked as WIldenstein 1 in the Catalogue Raisonee, and is still signed Oscar Monet, like his earlier caricatures produced in art school in Le Havre. It shows that Monet has signed up to the ethos and techniques of the Barbizon artists, painting en plein air and using fairly loose brushwork to capture the effects of light on nature. It shows, like Corot's work, Monet's developing ability to use colour to create space, depth, and effects of light using large flat planes of paint, and also shows Monet's future focus of water, sky, and light and shadow in greenery. This work is a copy of a view by Monet, and I include it here to show on the one hand the potential Basile would have realized had he not been killed in the Franco-Prussian War 6 years after this work was painted, but also to highlight Monet's abilities as a painter. Monet's original version of the view is from 1864, 2 years after his return from Algeria to study in Paris. And as well as developing the loose brushwork for the waves that would come to characterize later Impressionist work, also shows the subtle differentiation of colour that Corot showed, and uses the muted earth tones common to Corot's work. The composition of the partial blanket of cloud being moved, like the waves, by strong winds, incorporates the idea of a change in the effects of light, as the cloud conceals or reveals the sunlight. Baudelaire himself spoke of the relativity of colour in this way. Colour is thus the accord of two tones, warmth and coldness of tone, in whose opposition all theory resides, cannot be defined in an absolute manner, they exist only in a relative sense. The sense of the relativity of local colour can be seen in this diagram. The white central square is the same shade in both cases, but the neighbouring brighter yellow makes the white of the square on the right appear more brilliant. Monet's intensity of differentiation of colour has created beautifully observed effects of light. The partially overcast sky allows the diffuse sunlight to tinge the edge of the sheet of cloud, to provide subtle contrast between the blue aerial perspective of the distance and the dark tan shadowed middle distance, and to use the reddish green of the sea as a contrast to the blue-grey of the shadow of the boat. Monet also followed the example of the Barbizon artists by travelling to Fontainebleau, along with Basile and Renoir, as part of their efforts to submit work to the official salon. This work in Moscow is a smaller but intact version of the work which Monet had hoped to submit, and is an obvious tribute to Edouard Manet's work of the same name, which had caused the Salon des Refusés to be set up in 1863. The original work was not finished by the time of the Salon, and so was broken up and sold in sections, 2 of which are in Paris. As a substitute for the Deuxième, Monet submitted this painting of his model and future wife, Camille Danseuses, which was accepted by the jury. It was about this work that Monet made the claim to the press that it had been executed in 4 days, which was untrue. Perhaps this was an instinct for self-publicizing born out of the trauma of poverty, perhaps out of deep insecurity regarding his ability as an artist. In the following 2 years, Monet and the other Impressionists continued to push the boundaries of their brushwork and palette, using even looser strokes and a brighter palette depending less and less on earth tones. Monet's observation of fill, or reflected light, where shadowed areas are illuminated by neighbouring areas of light to enhance the effect of sunlight, is masterly. An interest in strong sunlight creating contrast between light and shade is a central theme in Monet's work, and these works show a change from darkening shadows in terms of shade of colour to the use of colours which contrast with the colour of the sunlight, such as the blue and magenta shadows of the figures on the beach. This work in the Louvre from 1868 introduced a theme to which Monet would return again and again: ice flows on the river Seine. And the way in which space is composed in the work would be something that Monet would return to in making his lily pond paintings in his garden at Giverny later in life. The mirror surface of the Seine on a windless day creates strong vertical reflection of the distant poplars, in contrast with the strong horizontals of the ice flows marking the surface of the foreground water. Later works use the same device with reflected trees and lily pads making up the entire space of the composition. Again, Monet has succeeded in capturing the atmospheric conditions with the heavy, perhaps snow-laden, overcast sky, using minuscule amounts of alternately slightly reddened tan and lilac in the grey. In this famous work, painted in Normandy near Etretat, the use of pale blue lilac shadow on the snow, in contrast with the raking pale yellow sunlight, makes this a memorable painting, but one which was rejected by the Salon for its lack of finish, its non-distinct brushwork, and lack of detail, and its innovative use of colour. The painting now hangs in the Musée d'Orsay. In 1869, Monet painted with Renoir at La Grenouillère on the Seine in the Parisian suburb of Croissy-sur-Seine, a fashionable place for river bathing, which Napoleon III and the Empress had visited. The work captures modern life in Paris, Baudelaire's prerequisite for art, but Monet has eschewed detail for the timelessness of light, colour, and painterliness, fulfilling Baudelaire's dictum, distilling the eternal from the transitory. In 1871, the Franco-Prussian War resulted in the invasion of Paris, and Monet and his family left for London. Its famous smog led to atmospheric effects of light, which Monet would return to in the years after 1899, painting 95 works, Wildenstein 1521 to 1616, over the space of 5 years. Whilst in London with Camille Pissarro, he saw J.M.W. Turner's works, which at that time were hung in the National Gallery. Also significant for his future prosperity, he met his future dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel. On returning from London, Monet settled in Argenteuil, a suburb of Paris on the Seine, in 1871, and was starting to achieve modest financial success with his paintings, in contrast to the poverty which had pushed him to attempt suicide on the birth of his first son Jean in 1867. This work takes its place among others, Wildenstein 221 through 224, done from the same spot, which observe changing light effects at different times of the day. Monet has expertly captured, with a short square brush, the peach colour of the diagonal late afternoon light falling on the path and grass, and the purples and blues of the trees' shadows. Monet has painted the modern chimneys and people in contemporary dress, but, remembering Boudin, it is the light in which this is enveloped that is the subject of Monet's painting. The post-war French government was predominantly monarchist and conservative, and the tastes of the salon reflected this, and hence Monet and his fellow en plein air painters set up their own exhibition in 1874 on the Boulevard des Capucines. Monet did not name his painting of the harbour at Le Havre after the town, as he felt its unfinished state made it unrecognizable, and hence called it merely Impression, Sunrise. The term Impressionism was born. At the end of his life, in June 1926, Monet was happy to use the term, stating that "the only merit I have is to have painted directly from nature with the aim of conveying my impressions in front of the most fugitive effects." He also complained that it still upset him that he was responsible for the name given to a group the majority of whom had nothing of the impressionist about them. This is Monet's first catalogue painting in the Gare Saint-Lazare train station in northern Paris, from 1877, Wildenstein 438. The station was significant for Monet as it connected Paris to Argenteuil and thereafter Normandy and the sea. The choice of subject matter is inherently one from modern life, and beginning in 1870, Monet had made 8 paintings that feature trains before this one. But, staying in a flat nearby provided by Gustave Caillebotte, Monet followed this work with another 11 works of trains inside or outside the Gare Saint-Lazare, recording the fleeting effects of the rising sooty steam, shadowy blue in the station's half-light, in contrast with the sunlit steam in the middle ground, and the sunlit stone buildings softened by the blue-grey of aerial perspective in the distance. In the 1880s, Monet began to distance himself from the Impressionist group, and returned to the sea in Normandy for his inspiration, and both before and after his trip to the Mediterranean in 1883, began to produce coastal scenes which have been described as deliberately picturesque, producing a series of 8 works on the rocks at Belle-Île, which he would exhibit together as a collective observation of the beauty of changing effects of light and water.